What is Marxism? By N E Balaram. Published by the Education Committee of the People's Progressive Party. Preface. The Education Committee of the People's Progressive Party, with the consent of the Communist Party of India, has reprinted their pamphlet on What is Marxism, written by N E Balaram. There have been certain minor changes, made with the consent of the CPI. The Education Committee considers that the contents of this study on Marxism-Leninism, though dealing with certain fundamentals, presents a clear and quite easily understood approach to this most important subject. It is felt that, for the wider and better understanding of scientific socialism, more Guyanese must read and study, discuss and understand, the ideology of Marxism-Leninism and its development, which have revolutionized the thought of man and have brought about the most profound changes of society in all of man's history. Besides providing a very readable text for those interested in the subject, the Education Committee hopes that it will serve as a ready handbook for those, students and tutors, participating in the internal educational work of the party. We wish to thank the author of What is Marxism, for writing such a worthwhile booklet, and the Communist Party of India for giving us permission to reprint their publication. Education Committee, People's Progressive Party, July 1978. Table of Contents. Introduction 1. A New World Outlook 5. Dialectics 9. Laws of Social Development I1L. Origin and Character of the State 14. The Basic Conflict 14. Value and Surplus Value 16. What is Capitalism? 20. Scientific Socialism. 23. Leninism 25. Communist Party and Revolution. The philosophers have only interpreted the world, in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. These stirring words Karl Marx wrote in his Theses on Feuerbach in the middle of the 19th century. What were the conditions which prevailed when Marx made this statement? It was a time when the world neither knew the theories of Planck, Einstein, and Pavlov, nor did it possess the scientific achievements of electronics, cybernetics, space technology, rocket or socialist construction. To declare in such conditions that revolutionary transformation can be brought about in nature and society and in man's consciousness required scientific foresight. How did Karl Marx acquire this foresight? He was not an astrologer or a prophet or even a saint. It was because he was a scientist who had studied the laws of development of nature, society, and thought. Capitalism had already become a developed system by the time of Karl Marx. Also stray ideas of opposition to it had begun to manifest here and there. It was in this background that Marx made his comprehensive study of the laws of origin and development of capitalism and its internal contradictions. In the process he even discovered the key to the door of a new era, an era in which humanity would progress from capitalism to communism. In that sense we call him a great visionary, but one thing must not be forgotten. He was a great genius who lived and thought like an ordinary man. Like some other bourgeois intellectuals of his time, he came to working-class politics from a study of philosophy. In this he had the most generous and active cooperation of Friedrich Engels. The two together developed the theory of socialism, liberating it from the utopian socialists into a scientific theory. Hence it is called scientific socialism throughout the world. From very early days man has been told not to steal, not to tell lies, not to sin and not to kill and so on. He is all too familiar with all these exhortations and expectations of triumph of good over evil, of overcoming hunger, poverty, and alienation, and of man's happiness in life. He has learned all these in his scriptures, in the Bible, Gita and Quran. But with what result? All the time his misery was on the increase and he found no end to evil or moral decay. It was not because of a dearth of great teachings or great books, nor was it because man himself wanted things to be so. Surely no man wants poverty, unemployment, cruelty, and other evils to last forever. Why is it then that these conditions continue to exist? This is a question which has been asked again and again through centuries. By the 16th century, with the rise and development of capitalism, this question became even more urgent. degree. If we look at the realities around us, we come across one fact which nobody can dispute. It is that the society in which we live is divided into two classes, the haves and the have-nots. This is most glaring evident in capitalist society, where on the one side are the workers and on the other the capitalists or the employers. The latter own all the means of production like the factories, mines, land, transport, etc., and the workers toil as wage laborers. The worker has to sell his labor power for his livelihood. The employer purchases his labor power by paying him certain wages. That is how production goes on. Here one thing must be clearly understood. These machines are being run not to raise the moral and cultural level of people but to bring more and more profit to the capitalists. Under capitalism, all the raw materials, machinery, labor power, and consumer articles etc. are nothing but commodities. They are bought, sold, and made to yield profit. This is the main process going on under capitalism. There is no place for humanism or any other moral value, and this is the evil inherent in a class society. The science that declared that this is not fate and that this system can be changed is Marxism. It is the most modern science that explains how society reached this stage and what the direction of its further development would be and what the forces are that will bring about this transformation. It gave mankind a new philosophy, a new political economy, and a new science of revolution. It can be called the guide of a new era for man because under its guidance 1/3 of the world has already destroyed capitalism and built up a glorious new social order. In the process, Marxism has been creatively developed and enriched. It has become Marxism-Leninism. Before we try to understand what Marxism-Leninism is, it is necessary to see how it arose, for then only will we realize fully its great contribution and significance. Even though capitalism first made its appearance in Europe in the 15th century, it was only in the 16th century that its full impact on the social and economic life of the people began to be felt. Ever since then there have been men who groped for a way out of it and who dreamt of a new and just social order. For instance, the English philosopher Thomas More in his famous book called Utopia described the idealistic way of life which was supposed to exist in an imaginary island of that name. Then there was the Italian thinker Tommaso Campanella who in his City of Sun portrayed a model society without private property. In his book My Testament, Jean Meslier, who was a French priest, had declared war on the king, God, and aristocracy, strongly arguing for bringing land under collective ownership. Babeuf, who was born in a poor peasant family in northern France, believed that communism alone can liberate man. Only a few important thinkers have been mentioned here. This shows that even though in an unscientific way some among the great social thinkers had begun to think in terms of some kind of socialism even before Marx, these new ideas were taking shape not only in political thought. Revolutionary discoveries were being made at the same time in chemistry, physics, astronomy, political economy, philosophy, and other branches of science. This led to the widening of the horizon of human knowledge. It was in 1751 that the first encyclopedia was published under the leadership of the great French scholar Diderot. It was an important work which dealt with agriculture, trade, industry, science, geography, economics, philosophy, religion, politics, linguistics, and many other subjects which greatly attract the intellectuals of Europe at that time. By the 19th century the horizon of human knowledge had widened still further. The theories of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant and the French astronomer Laplace on the origin of the world were such as to astound the thinkers of their time. They established that the Earth and the solar system were formed as a result of continuous prolonged changes and development of matter. Three other inventions in natural science smashed the old understanding about the universe. They were the discovery of the law of the conservation and transformation of energy, the discovery of the cellular structure of living organisms, and Darwin's theory of evolution. All these were discoveries which brought about big changes in man's thinking and opened up before him new ways to more discoveries about his universe, society, and his own consciousness. It was in this period of fast-growing science that German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialist ideas became more developed. It was by critically analyzing and developing these three main currents of thought that Marx and Engels presented their own teachings before the world. And with that socialism began its development as the science of the proletariat. Let us first examine what were the new advances made in the field of philosophy. As already pointed out, it was most developed in Germany, and the two people most responsible were George Hegel and his disciple Ludwig Feuerbach. While Hegel was an idealist, Feuerbach was a materialist. Hegel's History of Philosophy was a work which had created great uproar. It greatly influenced the young generation of Germany. Hegel pointed out that development was a dialectic process which resulted from the clash of opposing forces. Dialectics developed in ancient India at the time of Buddhism and was very much used then by the Buddhist and Jain philosophers. It had also flourished in ancient Greece and in China and was 3. Widely used in the discussions among scholars and philosophers in both these countries. But it had been lost in the intervening years before Hegel found it again and made it look fresh and shining with a new light. With the help of dialectics, Hegel could explain the laws of development in a lucid manner. He explained all its various aspects, such as the decay of the old, origin of the new, of lower forms giving place to higher forms, of the presence of conflicting forces in everything and always, and how quantity suddenly turns into a quality at a certain stage of development. However, Hegel's dialectics was rooted in idealism, and he argued that ideas developed according to dialectics. Nature and society have their origin in idea. He did not accept that matter is primary. He did not try to explain how ideas originate. As for mankind's history, Hegel even argued that social progress had reached its highest stage in the monarchy and feudal system of Prussia. It was by sharply criticizing Hegel's idealism that his disciple Feuerbach came forward. His philosophy is known by the name of anthropological materialism because Feuerbach argued that man was at the center of all philosophy. He did not accept dialectics, but he could still expose the drawbacks of Hegel's idealism and also point to the unscientific nature of religious ideas. In fact, he argued for a religion without God, which he named as the religion of love. Both Hegel and Freud raised German philosophy to a very high place in their IME. In the field of political economy, England was in the forefront at that time. And the contributions to classical economic thought made by Adam Smith and David Ricardo both Englishmen, were very great indeed. A scientific approach to the study of the origin and exchange of wealth and other fundamental economic issues was their major contribution. Adam Smith and Ricardo showed that wealth was commodities used in social transactions, and that the value of these commodities is determined by the amount of social labor involved in their production. They thus paved the way for the theory of value. Till then there was no such scientific understanding of value of wealth and its distribution. It was also a period in which a lot of discussion was taking place on socialism. At the head of this discussion were three outstanding thinkers. They were called utopian socialists: Henry Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier and Robert Owen, 1771 to 1858. The first two were Frenchmen and the third an Englishman. Their main contribution was to expose the nature of exploitation in a capitalist society and to visualize the birth of a new society in which this capitalist exploitation is eliminated and there will be no poverty or hunger or wars. Saint-Simon declared that the lords, the rich gentry and the priests were all parasites and that nothing bad will happen to society if they disappeared. Fourier said that capitalism was full of contradictions and that it had given birth to deceit, hatred, and betrayal everywhere. One wonders how many of present-day socialists in this country have the courage to speak against capitalism in such a language even today. Anyway, these utopian socialists had no idea of either the importance of class struggle in society or the creative power of the working class. Theirs was mainly the hope that the capitalist system could be reformed to yield good results through idealist propaganda and constructive activities. But the most important development was the rise of the proletariat as a powerful political force by the middle of the 19th century. It was a historical development. It scared all capitalists and property owners. It was an unprecedented phenomenon. Workers in Europe began to come out on strikes and organize themselves to resist repression. here was a new force spreading a new inspiration among the oppressed. For 10 days in 1831 Lyons, the main industrial town of France, was in the hands of textile workers and artisans who had revolted and captured power. There were no proletarian parties at that time, so they did not know how to proceed further, and their revolt was suppressed by the army brought from Paris. However, in 1834 the workers of Lyons again organized an uprising. In England two working-class struggles developed. The beginning of the famous Chartist movement, which was a PEOPLE's movement to submit a charter to the British Parliament and which shook England for more than a decade, can be traced to the years 1835 to 36. Meanwhile in Germany the textile workers of Silesia had revolted in 1844. There too the army was called out to suppress the workers' revolt. However, all this proved that the working class had already come on the scene by the middle of the 19th century in Europe as an organized force. It must be remembered that there was not much link between this working class movement and the socialist movement at that period. The socialist movement then was chiefly a petty bourgeois political movement. Most of the socialists did not understand the historic significance of the new rising force of the proletariat. Socialist theories were utopian. It was an historic necessity to fill this gap. The stage had thus come for a new ideology, the ideology of the working class. It was an inevitable necessity. It was in this background that Marx comes on the scene. A new world outlook. It is a fact that there are very few people who have no philosophical view of their own. Even though it is a common belief that philosophy is a useless activity, there are really very few people who have not at one time or other experienced the need to philosophize. It is mostly when faced with some crisis 5. in their lives that men give themselves up to philosophical reflections. They can be heard then to remark on the laws that rule the universe, about providence, fate, karma, and so on. Most people rely on idealism to reflect on these things. There is therefore no need to explain why one should study Pellows, Phy. It is common knowledge that man needs some kind 0. philosophy to guide him in his life, or at least to give him eteycdo, hence cannot be content with such an standing of the world and its laws. It is all right for Pha believe that things will geites as balasehoepe without any change. For them just mealist sea any, but for those who want to guanaster reconstruct this whole earth, this is not of any help. Eyn. A philosophy which will help bring about changes. They see a philosophy which will teach them that changes are inevitable, which shows them the forces that oppose and FSOs that support it, and points out to them the forces which are working for and against changes in the existing order. To them an objective study of the forces and the laws of motion is most essential. It was Marx and Engels who presentec this new philosophy which we call Marxism-Leninism. It consists of three component parts: philosophy, political economy, and the theory of scientific communism. New York of Marxism-Leninism is the general Cuafilio Algane of Val-Marxist-Leninist teaching. This philosophy is called dialectical and historical materialism. The unity and indivisibility of materialism and dialectness is what forms the basis of Marxist thinking, and that is why it is called dialectical materialism. These are not two unrelated independent concepts. It is fit to remember that both in ancient Greece and in ancient India there were great philosophers who used both together in their thinking. What other transformations have been brought about by this new world outlook, a world outlook which finds no contradiction between theory and practice and which has been praised as such even by its opponents? 4b. A careful examination of the world around us will show us that it is an infinite mass of objects and phenomena having innumerable forms and qualities. Is there something which gives unity to this great diversity? Is there a common quality for all these diverse things in the universe? This is a question which man has asked himself from the very early stages of human history. In an effort to answer this question, philosophers came to be divided into two groups, idealists and materialists. Just as we could see many subgroups among materialists, there are many subgroups among idealists too. Materialism is that branch of philosophy which contends that matter alone is primary. That branch which contends that primacy belongs to mind, thought, or spirit or idea is called idealism. The fight between these two branches has existed since the origin of thought. But as science developed, man could understand more and more of the secrets of nature. It is only through a series of evolutions that the world we see came into existence. There are evidences to show that the world existed even before man, society, philosophy, and religion originated. Under those circumstances, nature or matter is not a creation of the mind or a projection of the spirit. Such a contention is against reality. Man himself came into existence many millions of years after nature came into existence, that is to say, the world existed even before man's consciousness and thinking and logic developed. That is why Marxism is firmly rooted in materialism. The idealists have always tried to distort materialism and cast aspersions on materialists. They often allege that materialism gives no place for moral values or noble ideas. The fact is that Marxist concept is not only not opposed to progressive ideas or noble ideals, but Marxism attaches great importance to those values and fights for their realization. Marxism has shown how these have influenced the progress of mankind at different stages. In fact, what Marxism as a science tries to do is to materialize the noblest visions of the greatest sons of humanity about the future of mankind. So the propaganda that Marxism gives no room for moral values or noble ideals is based on blatant lies manufactured by anti-Marxists and vested interests. Anyone could see that the communist movement has hitherto and always fought against deception, exploitation, unemployment, wars, imperialism, and fascism. It is a movement which has tried to raise human society to a lofty stature of a communist society. Dialectical materialism has armed the working class with a world outlook which is basically optimistic and throbbing with vitality. It is a beacon which enables the proletariat to look into the future without any fear or anxiety. A common property of all things and phenomena in the world is that they are matter. Engels says that the real unity of the world consists in its materiality. Matter has many forms, it exists as atoms, elementary particles, and waves, etc. But all of them are matter, whose chief property is that it can exist independently outside man's consciousness and mind. That is why scientists have said that matter is objective. Lenin wrote, "Matter is the objective reality given to us in sensation." Let us also refer to some other properties of matter. First, we can know matter only through senses. Second, matter lies infinite in time and space. Third, though individual forms and phenomena of matter may disappear, matter itself is indestructible. Fourth, motion is the mode of existence of matter. That there can be no matter without motion and no motion without matter. These four properties are only briefly mentioned here. As science advances, our knowledge of these properties of matter also increases. The horizon of the world is getting more and more extended by new discoveries. That is why we say nature is infinite. We find that even the splitting of the smallest particle of matter, the atom, does not lead to an end or complete destruction of matter. It continues to exist as light, electromagnetic radiation, etc. That is why we say that matter is indestructible. Similarly, there is nothing, no phenomenon in this world which is not in motion, which is in a state of absolute rest. Hence we say that eternal motion is the property of matter. If an important question arises here, is there any relationship between matter and consciousness? Yes, there is. What we mean by consciousness is thought or the mental activity of man. We have already said that there is no thought without man. And thought itself has not been the same at all times. Do you think that the thoughts of man in the old Stone Age were the same as those of the present-day man in the modern socialist age? Certainly not. For the truth is that thought itself has developed with the development of human society. Everybody knows that man thinks with the help of his brain. There is close relationship between the brain and consciousness, and this can be proven by the simple example that you may become unconscious when you get a stroke to your brain. It is because the mind and body are closely related that doctors are able to treat patients for insanity, loss of consciousness, etc. So what is called consciousness is not something which is not in any way related to the human body. The ability to think is the special quality of brain which in the case of man has undergone the highest development in the course of his evolution. It is when the material world around us acts on our brain through our senses that we think or become conscious. But idealists do not agree with this view. According to them, the world itself was formed from consciousness or self, or what is called the Paramatma. That is why they say that what is material and not of the soul is Maya and is dying, whereas the soul alone is indestructible. They make this mistake because they refuse to accept the evidence given by history and science and base their thought on pure faith. 5. Dialectics. We have already mentioned that motion is the mode of existence of matter. We see motion in nature, society, and human mind. Where then does this motion come from? It is due to the action of some outside force, or is it due to some other causes? Dialectics answers this question satisfactorily. Let us examine it in some detail. If we look at things carefully, we can see that this motion or development is the result of the action of opposites or contradictions. The operations of addition and subtraction in mathematics, action and reaction in mechanics, positive and negative electric charges in physics, combination and dissociation of atoms in chemistry, excitation and inhibition in the cerebral cortex in physiology, and the class struggle in social science are examples of this struggle of opposites or contradictions. Engels says, there is a contradiction in a thing remaining the same and yet constantly changing, being possessed of the antithesis of inertness and change. These opposites, however, are not separated from each other but joined together. In capitalist society, for instance, there are the capitalist class and the working class. Though they act against each other and for opposite purposes, they also exist together in a sort of temporary unity. The same is the case with all other things and phenomena in which unity and struggle of opposites is a continuous process. It is this struggle that gives rise to change and development. In the words of Lenin, development is the struggle of opposites. The most important dialectical law of development is the unity and struggle of opposites. The question arises, which is more important in this, unity or struggle? I shall quote here what Lenin has said on this. He says, the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. Because struggle is absolute, it follows that nothing remains static. Everything changes. Therefore the changes in society and in man's thinking are also the result of this struggle of opposites. Now we take the second law of development. It is that quantitative changes are transformed into qualitative changes and vice versa. Quality is the sum total of properties which separates a thing or phenomenon from other things. Quality is not abstract but contained in a particular thing or phenomenon. And there is a great deal of relationship between quality and quantity. For instance, when water is heated, it retains its quality as water till its temperature rises up to 100 degrees Celsius, when it begins to boil and turn into steam. It is then no longer water. Here what we see is a qualitative change in the substance, namely water. There are many other examples like this which can be cited from everyday life. It should be remembered that just as quantity changes into quality, qualitative changes also lead to quantitative changes. In other words, there is a passage of quality into quantity also. This is a universal law of development. Peasants, for instance, know that if they use better quality seeds they can get a better yield for their crops. The change from quantity to quality is initially a slow gradual process and not easily recognizable at first. But at a certain stage in this accumulation of quantitative changes comes a leap when a thing is suddenly transformed into a new different thing. This is how transition from an old quality to a new quality takes place. For instance, take the evolution of man. It was a leap or a radical turn in the development of the organic world. Socialist revolutions also take place in the same way. A revolution in the social structure of a society means a qualitative change in the social system. For example, it is revolution that overthrows capitalist society and brings into existence a socialist society. This cannot happen through slow gradual reforms. The third law of development is called negation of negation, which means development from lower levels to higher levels, from simple to complex. Most people have very vague ideas when they hear the words change, development, etc. What does it mean? Does it mean mere repetition, or does it also involve new qualities? The law of negation answers this question. Marx says, no development that does not negate its previous forms of existence can occur in any sphere. It is the inevitable result of unity and struggle of opposites that in the process of development the old quality is negated to yield a new quality. This can be explained by a simple illustration. A plant grows from a seed, but by the time the plant has grown, the seed which gave birth to it is destroyed or negated. However, when that plant bears fruit, it produces several new seeds in the place of that one seed which had been negated. But there again a change happens. With the production of these new seeds the plant dies or is also negated. Thus the seeds which are produced as a result of this negation are never the same as the old seed. They are different seeds, different in quantity as well as quality. Negation does not mean simply the destruction of something old. It also means the preservation of the viable elements in the former stages of development. Take for instance capitalist society. Does its negation mean the destruction of all that was created by man in that society? Never. The productive forces and the means of production, the achievements of science, material gains, and cultural wealth are all preserved and have to be developed in a socialist society. In that sense the negation has also a continuity in it. Let us look at the changes that have taken place in human society. In the early period, man had only stones and bows and arrows as his tools. Today he has tools which can split the atom. This is the example of leaps from lower to higher levels, from the simple to the complex. Another example from nature is the development of organic matter from inorganic matter as a result of chemical changes. The development of communism is also similar. There was primitive communism in the early stage of man's development when there was communal ownership. In other words, all members of the community together owned all the wealth of that society, and primitive man did not know the distinction between the haves and have-nots. It was later that private property arose in society as a necessary factor for the development of human society. Today that is again being negated, and what takes its place will be scientific communism. It means collective ownership, but enriched with all the cultural development man has acquired through ages in the long process of his development. Here is therefore another example of the movement from the simple to the complex. We have so far discussed the main laws of dialectics. It mainly teaches us that all things and phenomena in nature are interconnected and nothing in this world stands isolated. Material things, ideas, and social institutions are all therefore related to each other. As science developed, our understanding of these things has also grown, and new discoveries have compelled even those who do not accept dialectics to concede that laws of development are real. These laws have a universal character. Marx and Engels did not view dialectics as a mere doctrine. They showed that it was a scientific method of cognition and a guide to action. They found that knowledge of the general laws of development will enable them to analyze the past, understand the present, and look ahead into the future. That was how they were able to speak with great confidence on the origin, development, and ultimate destruction of the capitalist system. Laws of social development. A study of philosophy is not for attaining some peace of mind, but to equip oneself for the task of changing nature and society. Naturally, certain questions arise. How does society develop? Are there any laws which determine this development? Is it a fact that society develops? Marxist philosophy gives satisfactory answers to all such questions. With its help we can analyze the entire history of the human race up to the present in a scientific manner. The sum total of the scientific formulations we derive from such analysis is called historical materialism. Historical materialism is an inalienable part of Marxist philosophy, and both Marx and Engels studied capitalism on the basis of historical materialism. At that time F.N. Taylism was in its childhood. Marx and Engels could foresee its course of further development and final overthrow, as early as 1847. In the Communist Manifesto they proclaimed to the whole world that the victory of the proletariat and the downfall of capitalism were inevitable, and even today the manifesto remains an historic document guiding revolutionary movements everywhere. Only with the development of historical materialism did history become really a science. Till then it was believed that history was a compilation of stray events, of stories of loves and quarrels of kings and queens and the crowning of princes. Historical materialism showed that it was not so. Many centuries ago man too, like the animals and the birds, was a slave of nature. It has taken many long years for him to start conquering nature. It is a long story in the course of which man had to face innumerable challenges. One of the most important developments in this long history of man's development was the appearance of classes in society. With classes came class struggle. The very first sentences of the first section of the Communist Manifesto says, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and juryman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended, either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes." The founders of scientific socialism thus stated that except for the very primitive stage, the history of human society through all other stages is the history of class struggle. Slavery first brought into existence two distinct classes in society, namely the slaves and the slave owners. These classes had an economic basis. The slave owners owned all the wealth, including the slaves. That was the origin of class struggle in society. The sharpening of the class struggle finally led to the overthrow of the slave society itself, paving the way for the rise of the feudal society, which again was divided into two classes, the feudal chiefs and the serfs. The struggle then began between the two classes in feudal society. When it reached its climax, capitalist society came into being. In capitalist society the class distinction was manifest. Proletariat on one side and bourgeoisie on the other. We are living at a time when class struggle has become most acute. 1/3 of the world has already become socialist. We do not see class struggle there because there are no antagonistic classes. Thus the history of society so far has been the history of class struggles. What is meant by classes? Lenin defines classes in these terms: classes are large groups of people which differ from each other by the place they occupy in a historically determined system of social production, by their relation to the means of production, by their role in the social organization of labor, and consequently, by the dimensions and mode of acquiring the share of social wealth of which they dispose. Thus under capitalism, the workers are one class and the bourgeoisie another class. These two classes occupy different positions in production. Their share of social wealth also differs widely. While classes have differed in different societies, they have always been, from slavery to the present day, either exploiters or exploited. Names may have changed, but the exploitation of one class by another has continued uninterrupted. It is necessary to consider at this stage why society became divided into classes. Was it because some people were born evil? No. Classes first arose when in the primitive society productive forces developed and there came division of labor, leading to greater production and surplus over and above immediate wants. In man's struggle with nature, the first to undergo changes were his means of production. It was a big step leading to big changes in production when he possessed tools made of bronze, iron, etc., replacing his old wooden and stone implements. The generation of surplus and the division of society classes with acquisition of private property begins at this stage. In the early period it was not the practice to take prisoners in the wars that were waged between clans. If ever taken, they were killed. but when it became possible to produce more than a man's immediate wants by his labor, prisoners began to be taken in these wars. They were not killed, but turned into slaves. These slaves were made to labor for their masters. That is how slavery first made its appearance. Gradually, there came the landlord and the serf, the bourgeois and the worker. It is only a very general description of class divisions in society that is given here. 2. When you examine these classes, you will find that they always had conflicting interests. In slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, the classes were always opposed to each other according to their interests. And hence the class struggles. So long as there are antagonistic classes, class struggle too is inevitable. As the class struggle intensifies, at a certain stage in the process, the working class captures power and goes on to create a classless society after eliminating the class differences. Such a classless society is called a communist society. Class struggle is not something which communists create artificially, as some people propagate. The origin of class struggle lies in the irreconcilable social differences between the exploiters and the exploited. It may be possible to contain or suppress class struggle temporarily, but it will always break out again. 13. In new forms. So long as antagonistic classes exist in a society, class struggle cannot be avoided. In other words, to be free from class struggle, antagonistic classes themselves must disappear. Origin and character of the state. The state-like classes also emerged at a specific juncture in human history. In fact, it was due to the division of society into opposed, hostile classes, that the necessity arose for the creation of a state apparatus. Engels' study of primitive society in his famous work The Origin of Family, Private Property, and State gives us a fairly good account of the conditions under primitive communism. All evidence points to the existence in man's early history of a society which did not know of a state, family, and private property. All these came into being stage by stage. With the breakup of primitive communist society and the rise of slavery, society became divided into classes. Those who owned the means of production became masters of great wealth and began to control and rule over the entire society. Accordingly, they also laid down the rules, regulations, and codes of conduct by which society was to be governed. Can the exploiters who form a minority subjugate the majority who are the exploited with the help of laws and moral codes alone? For that the police, army, courts and jails had all to be established. The sum total of all these means of coercion is known as the state. The exploiters set up the state apparatus at a particular stage in the history when class struggle became too intensified. The state is therefore not, as is commonly believed by some, an impartial body to maintain law and order in society, nor is it a divine creation handed down to man since time immemorial. Whether it is a monarchy, or a republic, the state is an instrument of coercion which protects the interests of the economically dominant class. Whatever changes take place in its forms, the state tries to achieve the same purpose in its content. When classes disappear from society, the purpose of the state as a coercive apparatus of class rule also disappears. That is why Marx and Engels foresaw that the state withers away in a classless society. The basic conflict. We have seen that history progresses through the conflict of opposite forces in society. Which are these opposite forces? They are the productive forces and the outmoded production relations at a given time. Class struggle itself is the expression of the conflict between productive forces and production relations. We will therefore examine here a little more this fundamental contradiction. Man needs food, shelter, and clothing to enable him to live, but none of these things are available to him unless he produces them jointly with other men. These are produced by people. 14. Working in factories and in fields. It means that society itself exists by the creation of material values. Without creating this material wealth so necessary for life, there can be no politics, no philosophy, and no culture for man. In fact, the social existence of man is the basis of his social consciousness. We are dealing here on social production. If we examine carefully, we can see that there are two factors which go to make social production possible. These are called productive forces and production relations. Productive forces include human labor and objects of labor such as coal, iron, land, and timber, and means of labor such as hammer, axe, railway, factory, etc. By their very nature, productive forces never remain static but are always growing. Thus not only the number of workers grows, but also the machines which they use for production are fast undergoing changes. Continuous development of productive forces is a must if man is to conquer nature to a greater and greater extent. This is achieved by continuously developing his instruments of production. As society advances, the process also gets accelerated, as can be seen from the experience of just the last 100 years. From mechanization to automation and now to cybernetization, such has been the wonderful technological revolution in this period. But then production cannot take place only with these productive forces. We have already noted that man does not produce alone, in isolation from other men. This was so even in the most primitive times. No man can by himself rule nature, and even when man was a hunter he did so in groups. Hence there must exist certain relationship between men if they are to produce. This is how production relations arise. The sum total of relations between the producers and the means of production, between the producers and the products which they produce, is called production relations. In essence, they exist as property relations in society. Production relations have not been always the same in society. In primitive society there was equal partnership in production, but it changed under slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. Different sections have different roles in social production, and when the means of production are in the hands of only a few people, it follows that there is no equal distribution of the products also. A change to this state of affairs, i.e. equal distribution, will come about only in a communist society. So we find from a study of history that production relations express themselves as property relations. Yet another important aspect is that once certain production relations are established, they have a tendency to remain static. Why is this so? This is because the property-owning classes always insist that the existing production relations should continue. The slave owners opposed abolition of slavery, the feudal landlords opposed changes in feudal relations, and 15. The bourgeoisie is today resisting changes in capitalist relations. So what do we see? Obsolete production relations refuse to change, and developing productive forces strive to change them. This develops into a contradiction, which we have found throughout the history of human society. Society exists and undergoes changes depending upon the unity and struggle of these opposite forces. To sum up, production relations are dependent on productive forces. To enable continuous production and development, there must be harmony between the two. But in fact, as productive forces are continuously being developed, at a certain stage their harmony with production relations get upset. It is then that a crisis in the mode of production arises. The contradiction within the mode of production gets intensified. This crisis is resolved by changing the production relations corresponding to the needs of the developing new productive forces. In other words, new production relations are introduced which will have harmony with the new productive forces. This is the fundamental law of social change. Value and surplus value. We have already seen that society cannot exist or develop without the production of material values. Are these material values created in a haphazard manner without any laws? No. Production and consumption have their own laws which are explained by political economy. The entire superstructure of society rests on its economic foundations. Once the economic foundation is changed, social structure undergoes change in its content and character. That is why we say economic structure is not permanent. Whether it is slavery, feudalism, or capitalism, each system has developed historically and is subject to further changes. But bourgeois economists do not admit this. They claim that at least the essence of the capitalist economic system is permanent. It is an expression of their fear that the capitalist system will one day be destroyed. Hence their argument that political economy has nothing to do with class struggle and that it is a neutral and independent branch of science. Marxism exposes this false theory, and Marxist political economy arms the working class with the best ideological weapon to conduct its class struggle. There is no question of neutrality here, and we can see this when we examine the issues. In capitalist system, the capitalist worships profit more than he worships God himself. Let us begin by examining what profit is. Some say that profit is the excess amount which a person gets when he purchases commodities at a lesser price and sells them at a higher price. Superficially this may appear to be correct, but when examined in depth it will be found that it is not correct. Capitalists not only sell commodities but they also buy many commodities. For example, a textile mill owner 16 has to buy cotton and machinery before he can produce cloth and sell it on the market. When he tries to sell the cloth at a higher price, will not others who produce cotton and machinery also try to sell their commodities at a higher price? Such things do happen, but then if all the capitalists try to cheat each other, the result will be that one man's profit will become another man's loss, and the sum total of these exchanges will not create any addition to the material values in society as a whole. That shows that value is not increased by exchange. It is increased in the process of production. The capitalist makes his profit because he does not pay to its real owner the full value of an important commodity which goes into the production of his goods. What is this commodity? How does the capitalist manage to deny its owner its full value? Let us examine that. Then we will find out the secret of capitalist exploitation. In the capitalist system, all commodities are produced for the market. Their endless exchange of commodities is carried on uninterrupted. The basis of this exchange is price. How is the price determined? Two commodities can be exchanged only if they have a common property in equal quantity. This common property of all commodities is that they are the products of human labor. When we say that a yard of cloth is equal to a pint of rice, what it means is that the labor contained in the production of a yard of cloth is equal to that contained in a pint of rice. It is this amount of labor that determines the value of a commodity. But the term labor does not give the real meaning. One worker may be very lazy at his job, another may be highly skilled and efficient. So the value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor to produce it, or the time that an average worker takes to produce it under normal conditions of production. A new commodity has come for sale on the capitalist market. The name of that commodity is labor power, and workers are those who sell their labor power, capitalists are those who purchase it. The capitalists claim that they are paying the real price for this labor power, and it is called wages. The worker sells his labor power to the capitalist, who in turn pays him his wages. Is this not a just exchange? Our bourgeois economists raise this question. No, it is not. If we examine impartially, we will find that it is not a certain amount of labor that the worker gives in exchange for his wage to the capitalist. What the worker does is to invest his labor in the commodity. What he sells to the employer for wages is really his labor power, and this he is compelled to do because he has no other alternative, as all the means of production are in the hands of capitalists. Like all other commodities, labor power also has two values, a use value and an exchange value. The capitalist buys the labor power to make use of it. Marx points out that 17. The use of labor power is labor. The capitalist has to buy labor power by paying the worker its value. But how is this value of labor power determined? It is equal to the value of the means of subsistence like food, clothing, shelter, etc. that are required by a worker to maintain himself and his family, without which he cannot labor. This value is not the same in all countries and at all times. It depends on the development of production, technological advance, standard of living of the people, productivity, and various other factors. The class struggle of workers against the bourgeoisie for better living conditions also brings about changes in this value. In fact, we can say that this class struggle is the most important factor in raising the value of labor power. What does it mean when we say that the worker sells his labor power to the capitalist? A capitalist may buy a worker's labor power for a month, or a day or an hour for which he pays him a definite wage. This is how work is done in factories. The worker works for a definite period fixed by the capitalist. He is paid the amount agreed upon by the capitalist. Then wherefrom does the latter get his profit? We shall take the case of a textile worker who works for 8 hours. Suppose he produces 16 yards of cloth in 8 hours and the price of a yard of cloth is $4. Then the price of the cloth he has produced comes to $64. Let us assume that the price of yarn and other raw materials and the depreciation of machinery to produce the cloth will altogether come to $40. The worker's wages are $8. Then $48 becomes the total cost of production of the cloth, which is priced at $64. The difference of $16 is the profit of the capitalist. This profit does not come out of the yarn or machinery used to produce the cloth or from the raw material or from the market. It has come from the use of the worker's labor power to produce the cloth. It means that there is a difference between the value of a commodity which is produced by a worker with his labor and the value of that labor power or wages which he receives. The capitalist pays the worker only the value of his labor power but robs from him all his labor. This is how surplus value is created. It was Marx who discovered the secret. To force the workers to labor for wages and increase the surplus value is the fundamental economic law of capitalist system. The value produced by the worker's labor is much bigger than the value of his labor power. In our example, the value of labor power is $8 for 8 hours, i.e. $1 per hour. He produces cloth worth of $64 in 8 hours, i.e. $8 per hour. Here we see the worker creates the value of his labor power in 1 hour. Then he labors for the capitalist for 7 hours. The labor for the first 1 hour is necessary labor and is paid $8 for it. The remaining 7 hours is surplus labor, for which he is not paid at all. The surplus is appropriated by the capitalist. From 18. The surplus value the capitalist gets the value of the commodities consumed in production, raw materials, fuel, end. Machinery depreciation. The remaining portion forms the profit of the capitalist, i.e. it is in the process of production that surplus value is created. So the exploitation here is not glaring but veiled and hidden. The secret of capitalist exploitation is the appropriation of surplus value by the capitalist. It is not the capitalist alone who gets the surplus value. Industrialists want the service of traders to sell their products. Traders want money to carry on their business. The industrialists require finance for carrying on production. So there must be bankers to lend money to both of them. Hence the surplus value derived by the factory owners is really shared by all these sections. One should not think that they share this money with pleasure. They are obliged to help each other. But they also engage themselves in stiff competition with each other. Marx explains this process as if in a novel in his great work, Capital. Production begins when the capitalist buys the means of production, sets up his factory and employs workers to produce by paying them wages. The money required for all this is called capital. When the capitalist sells his products thus produced, he gets an amount greater than what he has spent. His capital is therefore the value which is used to exploit hired labor and produce surplus value. In the beginning this capit equals was accumulated by the most rapacious and cruel methods, by robbing and looting colonies, by selling slaves, by driving cut peasants from their lands and such other evil means. There has been nothing more cruel in all history than this first accumulation of capital through inhuman methods. It was not by hard work and thrift, as they say, that primitive accumulation of capital was achieved. Not in all circumstances does money or factories or raw materials or machinery automatically become capital. Only in a society where a class has the ownership of the means of production and another class has to sell its labor power as a commodity for its existence does money become capital. In other words, capital is a form of social relationship, based on the exploitation of labor by capital. When the means of production are brought under social ownership, capital will cease to obey and labor power will also cease to become a commodity. Does it mean that under socialism, there will be no commodities? No. The main law will continue to operate and surplus value will still be created under socialism. But that is not made a means of exploitation as in the capitalist system. Under socialism it is used by the working class and its state to raise the people's living standards higher and still higher. 19. It means that the past begins to serve the present. The debt jabber ceases to be the master of live labor, it becomes a servant of live labor. What is _capitalism? Lenin gives the following definition of capitalism. Capitalism is the name given to that social system under which the land, factories, implements etc. belong to a small number of landed proprietors and capitalists, while the mass of the people possesses no property, or very little property, and is compelled to hire itself out as workers. A look at our towns and villages keeping the above vivid definition in mind is enough to give us the true picture of capitalism in its most naked form. We have already seen how surplus value is created. The capitalists increase surplus value in two ways: 1, by increasing the working hours, and 2, by increasing productivity. They use both these methods alternatively because their aim is always to increase surplus value. But this is opposed by the working class, with the result that in the capitalist system class struggle gets more and more intensified. The capitalist system has another basic contradiction. It is based on social production and individual ownership. Because of this, contradictions develop between the capitalists and the workers, between capitalists themselves and between capitalist countries also. Even though production is well organized in separate industries taking society as a whole, capitalist production is carried out in the most anarchic manner. Each capitalist tries to raise to the maximum the production in his own factory in order to increase his own profit. He never bothers whether so much production is really necessary for society. Not only that, when he finds more profitable branches of industry he tries to enter them also. As a result of this, the relationship and the proportion existing between different industries in the whole of society is upset. In the race to increase surplus value, machinery and technology are constantly improved, more and more capital is invested and production is increased, leading to an accumulation of commodities. At the same time, because of the maximum exploitation of the workers, the purchasing power of the majority of the people is relatively declining. The process thus leads to a crisis of overproduction. Even though infested with contradictions and crises, capitalism had a fast growth up to a certain stage. With the growth of industry and trade, there arose in many countries a wealthy section of the bourgeoisie which had its own political parties and political ideologies. It was in this period that the struggle against the power of kings, aristocracy, and the church became most acute, and bourgeois revolutions broke out in several countries. These bourgeois revolutions, which took place 20. In England in 1659, in France in 1789 and 1830, in Italy, Germany, and Hungary in 1848, and in the USA in 1776 and 1861 destroyed the feudal rule in those countries and established the state of the bourgeoisie in its place. It led to the rise of the new capitalist countries of Britain, France, Germany, the USA, and Italy, and unprecedented opportunities were created for capitalist development. Capitalism began to develop in different ways. In economics, production means the production of material wealth without which society cannot exist. When consumer goods are produced, they are used up, and therefore their production must be continuously renewed. In the early stages of capitalism, this reproduction was more or less equal to consumption. The profit was used by the capitalists to lead a luxurious life for themselves and their families. Moreover, production then was limited also. Production was carried on in small factories with a few workers only. Marxist economists call reproduction of that early capitalism as simple reproduction. But that stage did not last for long. With the coming of large-scale industries, production increased tremendously and the number of workers also increased. It was at this stage that surplus value began to accumulate, and a part of it was used by the capitalist for production purposes. Machines and raw materials began to be bought in greater quantities and more workers began to be employed to expand production. This led FNSN to in reproduction, which is called extended reproduction. In effect, extended reproduction means generation of more and more surplus value and thus accumulated capital. This shows the fallacy of the claim that accumulation of capital is the total savings of the capitalists. Accumulated capital is in reality the fruits of robbing the workers of their surplus value. As a result of this, wide disparities are created in society, with all the wealth concentrated in the hands of a few persons while the majority of the people are condemned to poverty and miserable existence. This is a constant tendency in the accumulation of capital under capitalism. Extended reproduction under capitalism is not a smooth or uninterrupted process. It has often to face obstacles in the form of economic crises. These economic crises are brought about by overproduction. On the one hand, there is an excess of production, but on the other hand, the people's purchasing power is greatly reduced due to intense exploitation. This is what leads to the crisis of overproduction under capitalism. Once economic crisis sets in, prices begin to fall and then production becomes seriously curtailed. Wage cuts and unemployment becomes widespread and credit facilities are curtailed drastically. The result of all this is extreme misery for the mass of people and even a good number of small capitalists. 21. Crash under the weight of the economic crisis. The first economic crisis occurred in England in 1825. Since then it has been repeated generally once in every 10 years. From depression to boom and again from boom to depression, this occurs just like revolving of a cycle. Hence it is called cyclic crisis. Each cycle passes through 4 different stages, viz. Crisis, depression, recovery, and boom. We have already seen what happens during a crisis: production is curtailed, machinery and goods are destroyed, wages are cut and trade faces a slump. These measures seriously affect the growth of productive forces. There is all-round misery, poverty, and unemployment in society. These are the characteristic features of a crisis. In the next stage of depression, even though the crisis is checked, there is no immediate change for the better. The accumulated stocks of commodities are sold at reduced prices during depression. It is also in this stage that capitalists try to raise their profits by increasing productivity through renovation of plant and equipment. As a result, production slowly begins to rise. This leads to the third stage of recovery. New machines are installed in industries which have overcome to crisis and production is stepped up. The rate of profit gradually increases and the market also begins to revive. It is also in this stage that both unemployment and fall in prices are checked and the economy gradually recovers to the level before the crisis had set in. Then comes the fourth stage of boom, when production is raised to the maximum. Commodities are sold at very high prices and excellent conditions prevail on the market. The capitalists try to invest more and more capital to garner more and more profits. Suddenly comes again a crisis of overproduction and the cycle begins to repeat itself. Engels once compared this recurring crisis to the capitalist system with the race of a horse. The animal runs for a distance, then trots slowly to regain its breath and then again races. The economic crisis of capitalism is also more or less similar in its behavior. Many a time it is the small fry that is crushed during the economic crisis. The big capitalists develop. Concentration of capital takes place. Big capitalists form themselves into giant corporations and monopolies. Towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, such was the situation when capitalism entered a new stage of its development, viz. Imperialism. It was one of the most important events of modern history and many had tried even to study and understand it. But their studies were incomplete, and it was Lenin who first made a careful and exhaustive study of the new phenomenon of imperialism. Lenin evaluated imperialism half a century ago. But his theory on imperialism is still a guide throughout the world. 22. Lenin described imperialism as the highest and final stage of capitalism. Not only all the internal and external contradictions of capitalism are sharpened and developed to their highest degree in the transition to imperialism, but it also acquires certain new characteristics during this stage. Lenin describes them as mainly three. They are monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, and moribund capitalism. Lenin first of all investigated the essential changes that had taken place in the sphere of production. In this he found imperialism has five basic economic characteristics. They are: the concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in i.e. economic sphere, the merger of bank capital with industrial capital, and the creation of finance capital. With this a new force called financial oligarchy emerges. The export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities acquires exceptional importance, the formation of international monopolist capitalist alliances which share the world among themselves, and the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed. Scientific socialism. Socialism has become a word of common usage today, and there would be few people who have not heard it at some time or other. Similarly, most people in our country are also familiar with the slogan, Inqilab Zindabad. But how many people know what is really meant by these expressions? There is a lot of difference of opinion in this matter, and many people use these words with different meanings. For instance, some would say that nationalization of banks is socialism. Some others think that agrarian reforms is socialism. Yet a third category thinks that cooperative movement is socialism. Then there are those who believe that Sarvodaya is real socialism. I need not extend this list of concepts. Suffice to point out that there are any number of concepts connected with the ideas of socialism. If all these were socialism, India would have been a socialist country long ago, for all these things are here with us. Yet what is the reality? It is that capitalism is growing in our country. The evils of capitalism, such as industrial crisis, commercial depression, unemployment, high prices, food scarcity, poverty, hunger, and moral decay are all increasing here. The profits of the capitalist corporations are rising, the capital accumulation of the monopolists is increasing in extent, and there is widespread black marketeering and operation of black money. There is no reason to feel surprised at this. At one time in 15 countries in Europe and Asia, social democratic parties which had proclaimed socialism as their aim had come to 23 power, and in some of them they ruled for more than a decade even. Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, Israel, Austria, Finland are included in the list of such countries. What they attempted was to introduce in those countries their own utopian, cooperative, petty bourgeois and humanitarian socialisms, but these countries have all remained capitalist, and the exploitation of the workers has continued uninterruptedly in them. On the other hand, conditions are quite different in the 14 socialist countries which have accepted Marxism-Leninism as their ideology. In these countries ranging from the Soviet Union to Cuba, there is no capitalist class, there are no stock exchanges, no cutthroat competition for markets, and no unemployment. Both industry and agriculture in those countries have been reorganized on a new basis, and the living standards of the people are continuously rising every year. Education and culture have spread to more and more people, and family life and social relations have been enriched. Even the sworn enemies of communism are compelled to praise the economic and cultural advance of the socialist countries. This triumph of Marxism-Leninism is not accidental. Even before Karl Marx, various kinds of socialist ideas had spread among the working class of Europe. Marx himself refers to such distortions as feudal socialism, bourgeois socialism, German socialism, and petty bourgeois socialism in the Communist Manifesto. But they all collapsed soon, and Marx's theory of scientific socialism established its supremacy in the field. This was achieved through a bitter struggle. Marxism became victorious by struggling against Blanquism, Proudhonism, Lassalleanism, Bakuninism, and so on. Marxism teaches us that a social revolution is inevitable. Can this revolution be artificially created? No, only by studying the contradictions in society and by uniting its growing forces can one organize a social revolution. The capitalist system is not permanent. Like its origin and growth, its destruction too is inevitable. There is a basic contradiction in this society. It is growing every day. It is a contradiction between the social character of production and the private capitalist ownership of the means of production and private mode of appropriation. As capitalism develops, this basic contradiction also develops. Further, the social character of production becomes more and more evident and intensified. This contradiction came into existence along with capitalism. Because the system itself arose as production was organized in factories which employed workers in large numbers. It is thus a natural tendency of capitalism to develop the social character of its production. With the development of capitalism into monopoly capitalism, imperialism, and state monopoly capitalism, this social 24 character of production also develops and reaches its climax. The capitalists have no intellectual or physical role to play in production except to expropriate the surplus value. In other words, they become nothing more than parasites. The result is that under state monopoly capitalism, all the material prerequisites are created in society for its transition to socialism. How can we end the basic contradiction of capitalism, viz. The contradiction between the social character of production and the private mode of appropriation? The only way to end it is to end the private ownership of the means of production and bring them under social ownership. But this will not happen automatically, and capitalism will not die a natural death. The monopolist bourgeoisie will resist to the last and try desperately to save their capitalist order. Hence only a socialist revolution can usher in a fundamental social change. The working class representing the new productive forces must rally under its leadership all other toiling masses and destroy the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie exercised through its state power and recreate in its place a socialist state. Marx and Engels in their time believed that the socialist revolution can become victorious only in countries where capitalism had developed to its highest form, or if the revolution takes place simultaneously in a majority of capitalist countries. This was so because they lived at a time when capitalism was growing in several countries more or less at the same rate, and they had before them the experience of the Paris Commune, which showed that the bourgeoisie of all countries would unite to crush the working class revolution if it takes place in a single country. But with the growth of capitalism into imperialism and moribund capitalism, changes also appeared in the prerequisites for the victory of the socialist revolution. It was Lenin who analyzed this new situation and formulated a theory of socialist revolution corresponding to the new imperialist stage. Leninism. Many of Lenin's great teachings appeared during the war conditions. It is during this period that the question of copyright creatively enriching Marxism was posed so sharply. Leaders of the Second International like Karl Kautsky were openly advancing revisionist ideas under the plea that capitalism was no longer the capitalism of the period when Marx wrote his Capital, and that it had undergone several changes since then. They argued that the working class movement should be a movement for reforms. They opposed all revolutionary movements. They advocated the slogan of defending one's own motherland in a war. With that, the Second International also collapsed. It was not an easy task to defend and develop Marxism in this difficult situation, and it was Lenin who performed 25. This great historic task. Hence Marxism came to be known as Marxism-Leninism in our times. Lenin wrote his famous work Imperialism, after making an exhaustive analysis and study of modern capitalism. He had begun his studies of capitalist development as far back as 1895. Some of the new trends in this development he had pointed out in his draft program of 1890. Further, in different articles such as War in China, Lessons of the Crisis, Concentration in Production in Russia, and Development of Capitalism, he has pointed out some of the new trends. In these articles he had examined the concentration of capital, development of monopolies, export of capital, exploitation of colonies, sharpening of contradictions and sharpening of the class struggle, and such other new features of imperialism. In his article on Marxism and Revisionism written in 1908, he gives a very lucid account of the economic crisis of capitalism. Lenin was familiar with most of the books which were then being published about capitalism, and he himself had translated in 1904 Hobson's work Imperialism. With the outbreak of the First World War, he began a detailed study of the monopoly capitalist stage, and its result was his great work, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. By the turn of the 20th century, capitalism had developed into imperialism, and Lenin's book gives a classic description of the characteristics of this last stage of capitalism. It is a continuity and development of the study of capitalism conducted by Marx in his Capital. Lenin pointed out that monopolies have entered the stage under imperialism. They control most of the raw materials, industry, and markets in the world. They dominate governments and exercise control over the economic and political life of the peoples. We have already referred to the 5 fundamental economic features of imperialism pointed out by Lenin. In the epoch of imperialism, the development of capitalist countries is not uniform but uneven. There are ups and downs. Some countries which were far behind come to the front, catch up with the advanced countries and outstrip them. The process upsets the balance of forces and leads to wars between the imperialist countries for the redivision of the world. The result is the weakening of the capitalist system as a whole. It becomes possible to break the weakest link in the imperialist chain. That means a real possibility arises for socialism to triumph in a single country or in a few countries at the same time. The idea of the general crisis of capitalism in the epoch of imperialism was thus advanced by Lenin in his works. Therein he pointed out with examples how the contradictions between capitalist countries become very sharp and world wars become inevitable. He also pointed out that the national liberation movements in the colonies would gain 26. Strength during this epoch. Lenin could foresee all this because of his deep study of the laws of capitalist development which took place during half a century after Marx. Lenin's contributions thus not only enriched Marxism political economy but also greatly helped Marxism to formulate the strategy and tactics of working class struggle in this epoch. They have acted as guide to working class struggles in capitalist countries as well as to the national liberation struggles in the colonies. Dialectical materialism was subjected to 2 revisionist attacks about this time, against both of which Lenin led a bitter campaign. On the one hand was the argument of bourgeois scholars who wanted to disprove materialism in the light of the new scientific discoveries and inventions, and on the other hand were some Marxist thinkers themselves who refused to see the essence of dialectics. In fighting the revisionists, Lenin emphasized the close relationship between natural science and philosophy and the necessity of enriching dialectical materialism in the light of newer and newer inventions. Lenin clarified the theory of reflection which functions the basis of the Marxist theory of knowledge. He boldly resisted all distortions of the theory which would lead to subjective interpretations and underscored that the new scientific inventions proved the primacy of matter once again. New forms of matter may still be discovered, but even so the fact remains that matter exists independently of and distinct from the mind or idea. In this connection he refuted with examples the arguments of Mach. Lenin further pointed out the importance of the fundamental law of dialectics, i.e., that development is the struggle of opposites. He explains this detail in his notes on philosophy. It was by refuting all the arguments of revisionists and opportunists who, being immersed in subjectivism, refused to see the significance of developing forces, that Lenin defended and rescued Marxism, the philosophy of the working class. In doing this, he also enriched science. Similarly, his contributions to scientific socialism are also very great. Previously, Marxists were under the impression that the victory of socialist revolution in one country alone was impossible. It was believed that revolution can be successful only if it is carried out in most of the developed countries at the same time. Even Marx and Engels were inclined to think so. But Lenin conclusively proved that in the epoch of imperialism, tremendous changes had taken place in the world situation, and it was necessary to evolve new concepts of socialist revolution. He categorically declared that it was possible to establish socialism in a single country. This he did at a time when Marxist scholars were wumbling on this issue. With this contribution of Lenin regarding socialist revolution, the working class gained a supremely important perspective. It showed to the working class the way out of the imperialist war. The victory of the Great October Socialist Revolution was later to confirm this teaching of Lenin that the working class of a country when revolutionary conditions have matured need to wait for similar conditions to mature in other countries but could go ahead with its revolutionary task. Lenin's emphasis on the dictatorship of the proletariat needs special mention here. Lenin attacked the anarchist theories of Bukharin that the proletariat has no need of a state. He opposed Koskai's bourgeois arguments denying the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. At the same time he pointed out that the socialist revolution can take different forms in different countries. Each has its own contribution to make, he declared. The socialist revolutions which triumphed in several countries after the Second World War confirmed the truth of Lenin's statement. We have not attempted here to explain in detail all the new teachings of Lenin. Only the most important of them have been dealt with here. Lenin's teachings also contain invaluable contributions on many topics like the agrarian question, national question, the question of socialist construction, etc. By showing that Marxism is not a dogma but a guide to action, he armed the world working class with all the weapons necessary to take great strides forward. Hence the triumph of Leninism in our times. Communist Party N. Revolution. In order to carry out its historic tasks, the working class should have its own independent political party. It cannot achieve this political task through trade unions or workers' cooperatives. History teaches the lesson that for the working class to capture power and to undertake revolutionary transformation of society, it required a higher form of political organization. It was Marx and Engels who first pointed out the necessity of a working class political party. They were the first to organize such a party. The Communist League, which they formed in 1847, was the first organization of that type. In the epoch of imperialism, Lenin enriched these organizational principles of Marx and Engels and helped to found the modern communist parties. His contributions to Marxism on organization are thus invaluable. By merely calling itself a working class party or by enrolling a large number of workers in it, a party does not become a real political party of the working class. The social democratic parties in some countries of Europe and Asia provide an example for this. Their coming to power in these countries could not bring about socialism, nor could their governments 28. Even prevent the bourgeois attacks on their working class and other sections of the masses. Only a new type of working class party could achieve the destruction of the capitalist system and build socialism. Lenin had begun to fight for such a party as far back as the 90s of the last century, and his fight against reformism in the Russian Social Democratic Party was to lead to the emergence of such a new political party of the working class. After the Great October Revolution, such new parties were formed in several countries of the world. This new party is called the Communist Party. What are the main characteristics of the Communist Party, the party of the working class? The portion dealing with this question in the fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism deserves our attention. It says the main thing that characterizes the parties of the new type is their irreconcilability to capitalism. The communists are waging an active struggle for its abolition, for a revolutionary transformation of capitalist society, for they hold that the taking of political power by the working class and the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat are essential conditions for this transformation, hence the intolerance displayed by communists for all forms of opportunism, which in practice signifies an adaptation to capitalism. The communist parties do not act blindly, groping in the dark, but are guided by the revolutionary theory of Marxism-Leninism, which scientifically expresses the fundamental interests of the working class. The party is a voluntary union of like-minded persons united for the purpose of applying Marxist world outlook and carrying out the historic mission of the working class. The meaning of this is very clear. It says that the special characteristics of this new type of working class party are to wage irreconcilable fight against capitalism, to bring the working class to power, to establish a government under the leadership of the working class, to undertake the revolutionary transformation of society, and to accept Marxism-Leninism as the guide to all its actions. What is the meaning of a political party of the working class? As long as classes and class struggles and conflicts exist in a society, political parties are born on the basis of classes. They emerge and work as the vanguard of given classes. Bourgeois political parties do not admit this truth. They try to protect their class interests by pretending to represent all the people and thereby misleading the people. Only the Communist Party declares openly before all its specific class basis. Any party in the present-day world which sincerely and truthfully strives to establish socialism and bring about a socialist transformation of society has to function only as a political party of the working class. Does it mean that a working class party stands only for the exclusive interests of the working class? No. The working class has no interests which are different from or opposed to the general interests of the country and the interests of the majority of its people. The interests of the working class and its political party, the Communist Party, are in harmony with the interests of the country and the nation. Only the working class and the Communist Party can fight resolutely and uncompromisingly for the interests of the country and the vast majority of the people. This is true in all cases, whether it is for national independence or building up of an independent national economy or the struggle for peace, agrarian revolution, or a scientific and democratic culture. When we say that the Communist Party is a voluntary organization formed by workers, peasants, and other toilers whose goal is socialism and communism, does it mean that no one else has any place in it? No. All other people who accept these aims and themselves join with the toiling people in their class struggles have a place in the Communist Party. Not only that, they have an important role to play in raising the socialist consciousness of the toiling masses and coordinating their struggles for their immediate demands with the struggle for socialism. We have seen that the Communist Party is the vanguard of the working class. But communists must remember that this role cannot be fulfilled by a mere declaration. Communists have to be constantly in close touch with the masses, must go wherever the masses are and work among them, leading their struggles, learning from them and thereby winning their confidence. There is no other shortcut for a communist party to become the mass leader. It will be a big mistake to believe that once the party has gained prestige among the people, it can become inactive thinking that the prestige is permanent. The mass contact of any party cannot last long left to itself. It can maintain and develop its mass contact only through constant mass political activity and mass struggles. We have already mentioned that some people have wrong ideas about revolution. In this too Marxism-Leninism has a precise scientific approach. Lenin had on a number of occasions explained this in his writings. We will deal here with certain important aspects. When we talk of revolution, we mean a socialist revolution. A socialist revolution and a working class revolution are one and the same. It is not an invention of communist thinkers, as some people say. The fact is, the developments in the present-day capitalist world are pushing the working class towards a revolutionary transformation of society. The ever-sharpening contradiction between the working class and the bourgeoisie in 30. Capitalist society has brought all forces of social contradictions into the arena of struggle. The accentuation of these contradictions naturally make a revolution inevitable. That is why Marxism-Leninism says that a socialist revolution is an objective phenomenon in our present epoch conditioned by the laws of social development. Whatever the admirers of capitalism may say to hide this fact, they cannot prevent this process. When discussing socialist revolution, it is necessary to make a concrete study of the various sections of masses who take part in it and their forms of struggle. No mature revolutionary party will try to approach these questions in a casual manner and with a simplified understanding. A socialist revolution is an open and direct clash between the working class and the bourgeoisie. But it must be clearly seen that it is not a duel between these two classes. One must remember Lenin's words, "Whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see it." There can be no pure socialist revolution, because there is no pure capitalism also. In actual life, capitalist society includes all kinds of remnants of pre-capitalist modes of production such as small-scale commodity production, agriculture, and handicrafts etc. As a result of this, together with the contradictions between the working class and the bourgeoisie, between the petty bourgeoisie and other sections of the people and the big bourgeoisie etc. also grow and become sharp in capitalist society. It is in this extremely complex background of struggles that the socialist revolution develops and takes place. Lenin in his left-wing communism says, "History generally, and the history of revolutions in particular, is always richer in content, more varied, more many-sided, more lively and subtle than even the best parties and the most class-conscious vanguards of the most advanced classes imagine. This is understandable because even the best vanguards express the class consciousness, will, passion, and imagination of tens of thousands. Whereas revolutions are made, at moments of particular upsurge. And the exertion of all human capacities, by the class consciousness, will, passion and imagination of tens of millions, spurred on by a most acute struggle of classes. It was said that this is an epoch of revolutionary changes. But this should not be understood to mean that revolutionary conditions are mature in all countries for the working class to come to power. For the successes of revolution and for the working class to come to power, certain specific situations are required in each country. A social revolution cannot be made to order according to the desire of a group of people or a party. Working class revolutions take place when social and political contradictions are intensified to the maximum pitch. In political parlance it is then called a revolutionary situation. Lenin points out three principal characteristics of a revolutionary. 31 Euro Second International, impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule in an unchanged form, when there is a crisis, in one form or another, among the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class which causes a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes burst forth. Usually for a revolution to break out it is not enough for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way, it is necessary also that the upper classes should be unable to live in the old way, when the want and suffering of the oppressed classes have become more acute than usual, when, as a consequence of the above causes, there is a considerable increase in the activity of the masses, who in peace_time quietly allow themselves to be robbed, but who in turbulent times are drawn both by all the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historical action. Without these objective changes which are independent, not only of the will of separate groups and parties, but even of separate classes, a revolution, as a general rule, is impossible. The sum total of all these objective changes is called a revolutionary situation. What it means is that a revolution is impossible without a national crisis, i.e. one which affects the lower as well as the upper strata of the people. It follows that the revolutionary party of the working class cannot base its tactics only on the sentiments of the masses, it must also take into account the behavior of the ruling classes. When the policies of the ruling classes have become bankrupt and the country is in the grip of a national crisis, people's discontent grows tremendously and the idea of a radical changes spreads among them. The masses are then called upon to decide one way or the other. They become ready for revolutionary struggles and go on to make history by their actions.